Hello and greetings, my friends. I'll be reading a Warhammer book that I would consider a classic. It's the second book in the Soul Drinker series. I'll get to the first one after I complete the omnibus. I'm getting to the Bleeding Chalice. It's a wonderful novel. What really makes this one great is Tektorak. He's the main villain, and just the way the Soul Drinkers deal with him is pretty comical. So, without further ado, let's begin. The years lay so heavily on the corridors of Liberium Terra that the very air was thick with age. The endless, tottering rows of bookcases and virtualized data stacks seemed chained down by the weight of the thousand upon thousand years of history. The Librarium was deep within the planet's crust, but even so, the indistinct hum of activity droned through the labyrinth corridors, just as it did everywhere else in the holy hive world of Terra. It was the sound of billions of souls grinding their way through the bureaucracy that kept the Imperium of Man together. Even the captain of the deletions unit felt the sheer importance of the information that filled the Librarium. He had lived on Terra all his life, immersed in the endless repetition of the myriad tasks that made up the government of the Imperium. He had done his job since birth, just as his forebears had done, and the shadows beneath Terra comprised his whole world. But even he, after the decades spent performing this thankless task, had some instinctive understanding that the Liberium Terra held a repository of particularly pure, dangerous history. The captain glanced around the next corner. The gallery he saw was lined with shelves of books, so old they were little more than banks of rotting paper, lit by yellowed glow globes that picked out the faint silver spider's webs that had been there, undisturbed for as long as some of the books. No one knew the full layout of Liberium Terra. Estimates of its size varied, as no one had been to its furthest extents and returned. The deletions team had taken 3 days of forced marching to get this far, but by the best estimates of the adepts who gave them their orders, the objective was close by. The captain waved his 10-strong unit forward. They wore black bodysuits with hoods that only left the eyes visible. Rebreathers built to keep aeons of dust out of their lungs. Their gloved hands held narrow-nozzled flamers, connected to fuel canisters on their belts, but the captain carried a silenced autogun with flaring flash suppressor. They moved quickly and almost silently, each one covering the other. They had always been members of the same unit, just as the captain has always commanded them. The captain didn't need to actually give them orders. They just did as they had always done, as generations had done in the endless predators game beneath Terra. The captain hurried down the gallery until it opened to a landing overlooking a tangled knot of bookcases and data stacks. The cases held huge leather-bound volumes, tarnished ISO slates, crumbling scrolls and realms of parchment, crammed into the shelves that had been collapsed here and there into drifts of tattered paper. The data stacks, blocks of smooth black crystalline material that could store remarkable amounts of information, ranged from sinister glossy black obelisks to elaborate info altars covered in filigree decoration and crowned with clusters of statues. Several of them bore images of the Adeptus Astartes, the armor-clad space marines who formed the elite of the Imperium's armed forces, battling aliens and corruption across the distant stars. The captain peered into the gloom that folded the labyrinth below. He spotted movement. A scholar worked in an alcove formed by the cases. Surrounded by discarded books, he was leafing rapidly through another. His face was incredibly wizened, and his arms had been replaced with jointed metal armatures that flickered through the book's pages with incredible speed. The scholar could have been a servitor, a mind-wiped automaton that was human only in the sense that it was formed from a rebooted human brain. Or it could have been a sentient human, a loyal servant of Terra, like the captain himself. acting out some task that was probably redundant and meaningless, but which represented the loyalty of everyone on Terra to the immortal God Emperor. The captain raised his autogun close to his face and focused on the hairless, tight-skinned skull of the scholar. The autogun coughed once, and the scholar's skull crumpled, as if paper thin. The body slumped, sprawling across the shelf behind it and disappearing beneath a cascade. There had been no witnesses. That was the way. Had the scholar been aware of it, he would have understood why he had to die. The captain vaulted from the balcony down to the shadows below. The rest of the unit followed him, their feet padding on the tarnished wood of the floor as they landed. Down here, the air was so heavy with age and knowledge that moving around was like walking through water. The faint, sickly glow from the electro lanterns, dotted here and there, served only to make the shadows harder. The captain spotted some tiles and dates on the volumes on the shelves. The books held details of the Imperium's armed forces, regimental histories of the Imperial Guard, and accounts of long-forgotten battles. The death of billions of men were glossed over in those pages, and the captain could almost hear the screaming from the same pages that praised their sacrifice from the Emperor. A simple hand signal, and the deletions team spread out, each taking a section of bookshelves and pulling out volumes at random, glancing at the covers and contents, and then casting them to the floor. A servitor appeared without warning, its deformed, splayed fingers spinning along the floor in fruitless attempt to keep it clean. The nearest of the unit turned, spraying a lace of flame through the vulnerable, soft human core, and turned back to his work as the servitor shuddered and died in a burst of sickly smoke. Another unit member hurried to the captain. He was holding a book of red leather, its pages edged in gold. On the cover was a raised symbol of black stone, a chalice surrounded by a spiked halo, the symbol they had been ordered to look for. The captain tapped the nearest deletions trooper on the shoulder. The trooper then tapped the nearest to him. The signal passed through the whole team in a heartbeat. They dropped whatever they were holding and drew their flamers. They fired plumes of flame to the bookshelves, filling the power charged air of the Librarium Tarot with a stink of flame and smoke. The protective clothing of the team reflected most of the heat, but the labyrinth was still a furnace, with walls of superheated air billowing between the burning pages. The captain removed the magazine of his autogun and replaced it with a single round picked from his belt. He aimed at the closest data stack, which was shaped like a 3-paneled altarpiece, with its mim crystal worked in heroic images of battle. The gun fired again, with barely a sound, and the explosive round shattered the crystal to a flood of broken black glass. Wordlessly, with an efficiency born of generations of toil, the deletion unit moved through the whole section of the library, burning and shattering anything that might hold information they had been ordered to destroy. Already, the energy suppression drones were hovering around them every corner, projecting dampening fields that held back the heat of the flames and kept them from spreading. When the team left, the drones would move in, and their overlapping fields would smother the flames, but not before the books and data stacks were reduced to smoke and ash. Centuries of history were lost. Whole planets and military campaigns vanished forever from imperial history. But more importantly, by far, the deletion order had been carried out. All official record of the Soul Drinkers chapter was erased from mankind. Like most of the Imperium, no one really knows when Chorus had been settled. The gray-green, mostly featureless world had supported continent-spanning rocks farms for longer than the administratum could accurately record. The agro world was supported by barely 10,000 souls, but it was a critical link in the macroeconomy of the systems that surrounded it, for Grox formed a commodity as vital as guns or tanks or clean water. Grox were huge, lumbering, reptilian, unsanitary, and foul-minded. Crucially, however, they were almost entirely edible, each producing a mound of colorless, tasteless, stringy but nutritional sound processed meat. Without the groks that were lifted from Chalice in a vast bellied cargo ship every 3 months, billions of workers and gangers on nearby highworlds would starve, riot, and die. The shipyards of half a segmentum would find their human fuel faltering. The administratum knew how important the groks were. They administered the agro world directly, circumventing tax-dodging governors and grafting private enterprise by keeping their own adepts as the sole power, indeed, the whole population. Very little of interest happened on Chorus, a situation the adepts the administration worked hard for. The roaming herds of groks and the small islands of adept habitats went centuries with scant incident. The passing years marked only by the arrival of huge dark slabs of cargo ships, and occasionally desultory deaths, births, and promotion amongst a handful of humans. So when a ship actually landed in the planet's only spaceport at Habitat Ellipsen, carrying something other than enough to replace a stampede death, was a very rare event. The ship was small and very, very fast compared to most, composed of a cluster of flaring engines that tapered to a wedge of a cockpit. There were no markings and no ship name, whereas an administrative ship would bear the stylized alpha of the organization, Adept Median Vitrus. The highest ranking adept in the world guessed the ship carried someone or something important. She quickly donned her black formal administrative robes and hurried across the meager, dusty streets to the habitat to greet the ship's occupant. She didn't know how right she was. Habitat Ellipsen, like every other structure on the planet, was formed of gritty brown rockcrete, pre-molded and dropped from low orbit. The buildings were ugly and squat, the architecture featureless, windows with dark reflective glass, and kept the glare of orange evening sun from the offices, workrooms, and tiny living quarters. The spaceport was the only feature that made Habitat Ellipsen remarkable, a prefabricated circle jutting from the edge of the habitat. There was a small unmanned landing control tower and a few unused maintenance sheds, indicative of how few ships landed here. A section of the ship's hull lowered with faint hiss of hydraulics. Feet trampled out the ramp, and 3 squads of battle sisters marched out. Soldiers of the ecclesiarchy, the church of the emperor, and the spiritual backbone of the imperium. They wore ornate black armor that clad them from gorget to foot, and carried enough firepower in their hands and flamers to reduce the habitat to smoking rubble. Their leader was more stern-faced than the rest of the sisters, and old in a way that suggested she was a damn good survivor. She bore a huge bladed power axe. The armor of the sisters was glossy with white sleeves and tabards. Order and squad markings had been removed. The sister superior said nothing to Adept Median Ventress as the sisters of battle filed out in the spaceport's surface. They flanked the ship as an honor guard, weapons readied as if anything in the habitat could threaten them. Adept Ventress had heard of the sisters of battle, of their legendary faith and skill at arms, but she had never seen them in the flesh. Was this some priestly delegation then? The Missionaria Galaxia, or a confessor come to see the planet's spiritual health? Ventress mentally congratulated herself on having the habitat's small ecclesiarchy temple swept out just 3 days before. The next figure on the ship was a man. He was not particularly tall, but his considerable presence was aided by the carapace armor that covered his torso and upper arms, and floor-length blast coat of brown leather lined with flax-weave plates. His face was long and lined, his jaw pronounced, and his nose slightly lumpy, as if it had broken and set a few times. His eyes were a curious grayish blue, larger and more expressive than eyes set in that face that had a right to be. His black hair was starting to thin. Subtle implants in one temple, and behind the ear were four neurojacks, simple as far as augmetics went, but far beyond the means of any planet-bound adept. His hands were gloved. One held a data slate. The honor guard strode past. He strode past his honor guard of sisters, glancing at the sister superior with a barely perceptible nod. The watery sunlight of Chorus glinted off the rings in his free hand. The stiff breeze fluttered over them in the hem of his blast coat. Adept, he asked as he walked over to Vitris. I am Median Lacmilia Vitris, chief adept of this habitat, said Vitris, tingling with the realization that this visitor must be far more than anyone she could have ever met before. I oversee the planet's most precious, productive continent. We have 500 million head of groks, and I'm not interested in groks, said the stranger. I ask only for a few hours of your time and access to one of your adepts. There need be minimal disruption to your important work here. Vitris was relieved to see a subtle smile on the man's face. Certainly, she said. I shall see to know your name and office for the records. We can't have just anyone wandering around our facilities. And of course, you and your colleagues will need to walk through our disinfectant footbaths. There will be a quarantine protocols if you wish to leave the habitats as well. So once I know under whose authority you are acting. The man reached to his blast coat and took out a small metal box. He flipped open the lid of the box, and inside Vitris saw a stylized eye, a gleaming ruby, and silver surround. Authority of the Emperor's Inquisition, said the man with the same smile. You need not know my name. Now, will you kindly direct me to Adept Dis? Inquisitor Thaddeus was an extraordinarily patient man. It was this quality above others that had kept him doing the Inquisition's work when more violent or brilliant or strong-armed had found themselves lacking. The Ordo Hereticus, the branch of the Emperor's Inquisition that rooted out threats amongst the very men and women it was sworn to protect, needed all those qualities. But it also needed the understanding that the Imperium could not be healed of all its sickness at once. It needed men who could see the enormity of a task that stretched far beyond their own lifetimes and not give way to despair. Thaddeus knew that. As just one man, even with the magnitude of the resources he commanded, he could do but little in the grand scheme of the Imperium, the divine Emperor's wishes for mankind. At present, he had a full company of Ordo Hereticus stormtroopers and several squads of battle sisters under Sister Asarian. But he knew that even their guns, corruption, and incompetence that threatened the Imperium from within, just as aliens and demons threatened from without. The whole Inquisition had that responsibility. If the task was ever to be finished, it would be finished by men and women of the Ordo Hereticus, many generations distant. Thaddeus understood all this, and he was willing to give his life in the cause, because if he did not, who would? Thaddeus, it was precisely because of his patience that Thaddeus had been given his current task. The first Inquisitor to have been taken on this mission, a bloody-minded, morbidly stubborn soul named Saurus, had been selected because he happened to be the only one available at the time. He had failed because he had no patience, only a burning determination to win visible triumphs and terrify and amaze those around him. Saurus and Inquisitors like them had their uses, but the mission had not been one of them. When there was time, the Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus had selected Thaddeus to take over because Thaddeus could succeed by picking away the layers of lies and confusion until the truth was uncovering before its captors realized. At that moment, Inquisitor Thaddeus wished he had not been given the mission at all. Though the higher purposes of the Inquisition were burned into his remarkably resilient mind, he was still ultimately just a man, and he knew a dead end when he saw it. The few available leads had dried up, and now the man sitting across from the untidy desk opposite him was grim, as if this was possibly the last hope. "I do hope I am not inconveniencing you," said Thaddeus, who never saw any reason to be impolite, no matter what state of mind. "I understand the importance of the work done here." "The numbers aren't important," said Adept Dees. "I just stamp forms all day." Dees had, until recently, been a fit man, middle-aged, wearing well. Now he had given up on himself and was putting on weight, even though he still looked sharper than anyone on this planet had a right to be. Thaddeus raised a cocked eyebrow. "You sound as if the Emperor's Grox Farms has little to do inspire you." "Median Vitreous would be discouraged to hear that." "If you had spent as much time as I have been balancing the books for this place, you would know Median Vitreous can hardly count. She can have her opinions, but I keep this planet making the administrative ties." Thaddeus smiled. "You speak freely, a rare thing, believe me, refreshing in a way. If you have come here to kill me, Inquisitor, you will do it no matter what I say. But if you have not, you won't waste the bullet." Thaddeus sat back in the uncomfortable chair. The other adepts had shown sense to leave the office before Thaddeus had asked for them to be removed, so the only sound was the grinding of a cogitator somewhere in the back of the low-ceilinged room. Dust motes floated, and a thick light from the setting sun outside. The office was home to maybe 30 adepts, each at a partitioned workstation. Every wall and surface was covered with paper, statistical printouts, graphs, charts, graphic depictions of the many diseases that plague the common groks, and grim notices reminding the adepts of the ceaseless sacrifice they were compelled to make for the Imperium. The administratum tried to foster the same atmosphere, whether it was running a palace or a workhouse. Its members dedicated their lives to jobs. Without the microeconomy, the Imperium would collapse. You are an intelligent man, Adept. Not many of your station would know an Inquisitor when they saw one. Median Vitreous certainly didn't. I have heard men swear blind we don't exist, although we're all fighting evil gods and don't bother with the likes of mortals such as yourself. But you seem to know rather more than them. Am I right, Consul?" The adept smiled bitterly. "I'm glad to say I no longer hold that office. I think we understand one another. Consul Signoris Iconathus Gullion Graviclor. You know what I am here to talk about." "It's been a long time since anyone called me that." Clor seemed almost nostalgic. "I could have had command of the whole sector. If I just towed the lines for a few years more. But I wanted to know too much too fast. You've probably seen it before." "You understand," Thaddeus said without changing his tone. "The Inquisitor Soars continued to death in your absence." "I assume so," said Clor. "How many of the others got out?" "Not many. Captain Trentius was spared, though he will never pilot anything larger than an escort. A few menials Soros decided were sufficiently minor to be incapable of true incompetence. But most of the rest were executed. I must say, though, Soros is not the subtlest of my colleagues. You have showed most resourcefulness in evading him for as long as you have." Clower shrugged. "I planet hopped for a while. Faked up some references. I talked the talk, so there weren't too many questions. But I got posted here eventually, and I wasn't intending to go anywhere else. Not many people look in the face like this for a wanted man. At least, I thought so until you showed up. You should know, Consul, that you don't do anything administratum without somebody writing it down. Your paper trail was as long and winding, but I have associates who could follow it. Well, said Clorer. He looked more exhausted than frightened, as if he had always known this day would come and just wanted it over with. The soul drinkers. Yes, the soul drinkers. In light of your cooperation, I shall let you begin. Cloer sat back and sighed. It was 3 years ago. You know the dates better than I do. Anyways, we've been detailed to take over the Van Scovold Star Fort. We knew the Van Scovolds had some alien trinket that was particularly valuable. We fed it into a couple of databases and found out it was the Soul Spear. The Soul Drinker's artifact? The very same. It was a legend the search turned up, some poem about how it could level cities and kill demons and the like, and how they lost it. Cloer sat up sharply and leaned across the deck. I am a greedy man, Inquisitor. I am ambitious. I could have let the Imperial Guard do it, but I wanted it finished quicker and cleaner. I know I could have left the Soul Drinkers out of it entirely. If I had just played it by the book, I would have saved us all a lot of grief. But like I said, I am greedy. I mean, we all want something. There are far greater sins, Consul said, the veneer of understanding that surprised many. You let the world go out that you found the Soul Spear. The Soul Drinkers would arrive, eliminate all resistance, and take it with them, leaving you to march the Star Fort unopposed. Is that the case? If it happened like that, I wouldn't be shoveling rocks for the rest of my life. But you know all this. What can you tell me of Sarpedian? Cloer thought for a second. Not much. I only saw him on the bridge screen. We had an Adeptus Mechanicus ship with us. They sent a teleport crew to the Star Fort and snatched the Soul Spear right from under Sarpedian's nose. Thaddeus could imagine what Sarpedian would have looked like to a gaggle of naval officers and administrative adepts. A space marine, commander, a psyker, an angry man burning with betrayal. Cloer was calm, having imagined his final reckoning with the Inquisition for some time. But even so, the fear must have felt when he first saw Sarpedian played briefly over his face. Were you able to judge his state of mind? Asked Thaddeus. His intentions? Cloer shook his head. I wish I could tell you more, Inquisitor. He was angry. He was prepared to kill anyone that got in his way. But you know that. You haven't found them, have you? That's why you're here. Not for me. The Soul Drinkers will be found, Consul. You must be desperate to have gone to the trouble of tracking me down. I was just along for the ride, Inquisitor. Saurus was calling the shots, and presumably he couldn't help you. But what did you think I could tell you? Cloer was a sharp man. In many ways, he was the first decent adversary Thaddeus had encountered for some time. It was difficult to threaten a man who perfectly resigned to his death sentence. He had guessed that Thaddeus was loath to admit. The Soul Drinkers' trail had turned cold. There were barely any leads left from the debacle at the Serbian field, when Saurus and the battle fleet, nominally under Cloer's command, had been outfoxed and eluded by the fleet of renegade space marine. Sarpedian and his chapter numbered less than 1,000 men, and such a force was barely a speck in the vastness of the Imperium, almost invisible against the boundless galaxy. Cloer was, in a very sense, one of Thaddeus's last hopes. You are one of the few surviving individuals to have any contact with the Soul Drinkers, said Thaddeus. There's a chance you picked up something Saurus did not. Cloer smiled, almost in triumph. To think a humble agri-world adept should cause the mighty Inquisition such woes. I can only tell you what you already know. Sarpedian wouldn't give up, not ever. He cares for his honor more than his life or those of his men. He'll run he'll run if you make him and attack whenever the risks, if there's a principle at stake. That's all I know. From the sound of it, that's all anyone knows. Thaddeus looked up grandly, letting his blast coat sweep around him. The Inquisition knows where you are, consul. You do the Emperor's work much better here than if you had attained a higher rank. I feel, and for this reason, you can consider your execution indefinitely stayed. But should your standards fall, I can ensure your sentence is carried out. We will be watching your tithes with great care. So, until then, consider my presence here non-existent. Continue the work of the administratum, adeptis. The man who had been consul signoris Clover gave a sardonic salute and returned to the thankless task of sifting through the mountains of forms at his desk. Thaddeus swept out of the office, down the darkened stairway, and out to the grim exterior of the habitat at Ipsen, where the evening sun was now setting, and the endless rolling fields beyond the habitat were dark with the urds of sleeping rocks. The sisters were waiting by the ship. Prepared for takeoff, sister, Thaddeus said to Sister Assyrian. There's nothing here? She asked. Sister Assyrian talked to Thaddeus as if she was his equal, for which Thaddeus was grateful. Nothing. Soros left us precious little when he put half the Laconia persecution to death. Have faith, Inquisitor. The soul drinkers have committed blasphemy in the sight of the Emperor. He will guide our hand if need be. I am sure you are right, sister, but I imagine the Inquisitor does little to help those who cannot prove their worth, and we have proven very little so far. Thaddeus and Assyrian walked up the ramp and into the body of the ship. The sisters trooped in behind, feeling to the personal compartment. The ship was clean and new, requisitioned by the Ordo Hereticus from the shipyards of Hadrafjord, and a rare example of craft, both small and fast, with the maneuverability and firepower to look after itself. The inside was simple, glossy, black, and bare metal, decorated with devotional texts to the Emperor that the sisters had pinned on the bulkheads. Walls and small shrines. Thaddeus had kept the trappings of faith from the cockpit, but gradually the sisters had taken over everywhere they were stationed and had turned to a mobile chapel to the Emperor. Assyrian joined her battle sisters in the grab couches inside. The sisters murmured a prayer of respect as she took her seat beside them. Thaddeus headed for the cockpit, which he had upholstered with dark maroon tharhide. His co-pilot's seat was nestled to the installed pilot servitor. Once human, its facial features had been replaced with an array of scanning devices. One of its hands was now a set of gold-plated compasses that stitched out trajectories in geometric shapes on the data slate jutting from its rib cage. On the other hand, was hardwired to the instrument panel of the cockpit and sent messages from its once human brain to the ship's carburetors and engine controls. Launch, said Thaddeus to the servitor. The remnants of its brain recognized the command, and the ship lurched as the thrusters on its underside kicked in. The featureless landscape of Chorus yawed and was replaced by the clear blue sky. Suddenly, the ship's primary engines roared, and Thaddeus was thrust into the deep upholstery as the ship roared through the planet's atmosphere. Thaddeus didn't know if anyone else would go to the trouble of hunting down Consul Signor's Clover. He hoped they didn't. Adeptis was doing far more for the Emperor's flock than Clover ever would have. Finding him and letting him live passed for a small victory, and Thaddeus anticipated few enough of those. The soul drinkers were tough and resourceful, and their intentions were unknowable. Though a Space Marine chapter could conquer just about anything, it still consisted of just 1,000 men, and the soul drinkers were probably numbered significantly less. Thaddeus's own staff numbered more, and he did not wield the massive household army of some of the inquisitorial lords. The soul drinkers could disappear if they wanted to, but they would not. That was Thaddeus's best hope. Sarpedian was still, in many ways, a space marine. He would not just sit tight in some corner of the galaxy waiting to be forgotten. He still believed in something, no matter how twisted, and he kept on fighting. The soul drinkers would do something to make themselves visible again. Thaddeus would be there, and he would find them. He would trap them and kill Sarpedian if he could. Then he would coordinate whatever resources he needed to shatter the remnants of the Soul Drinkers chapter for good. He had faith, like Sister Asarian. And even if that was all he had, it was enough. The Soul Drinkers chapter had disappeared in its entirety at the climax of the Laconia persecution, when the chapter's fleet had fled through a long-forgotten warp route, leaving Inquisitor Saurus's battle fleet grasping at nothing. The events leading up to the persecution had been enough to mark the chapter as rebels of most the dedicated and dangerous sort. An attack on the Adeptus Mechanicus, the destruction of the Laconia Star Fort, the refusal to submit to the inquisitorial examination, and the killing of the interrogator sent by Saurus to deliver his ultimatum. When the smoke cleared, the Soul Drinkers had vanished from the face of the Imperium. Well over a year later, salvage crews on the far galactic east reported a huge find, a massive graveyard of ships, some battleship-sized, that had all been destroyed by scuttling. The investigating Imperial authorities soon ascertained this was the Soul Drinkers' fleet, including the mighty battle barge Glory and a shoal of strike cruisers and support craft. Of the Soul Drinkers themselves, there was no sign. No one knew where they were or how they were traveling. But the fact that they had destroyed their own fleet, one of the most powerful independent forces for some sectors around, indicated they were determined to make it difficult for anyone tracking them to follow. The fleet could have been tracked, but these mere thousand men could not be tracked, not when they had the miserable vastness of the Imperium to hide in. And so it came to Inquisitor Thaddeus of the Ordo Hereticus. There was no question of letting Saurus carry on with the task of hunting down the Soul Drinkers. He had let them slip by once, and that was once too often. Thaddeus had few leads left to follow from the wreckage of the persecution and the burned-out remnants of the fleet. Chloe was the last to be exhausted, like the others. Archimagos Korbatov of the Adeptus Mechanicus killed in a genitorium explosion on the Forge World Coden Taratus, Captain Tarentus of the Cardinal Byzantine, and a few others who had survived Saurus's enthusiasm. He had yielded nothing to indicate where the Soul Drinkers were or what they were planning, but Thaddeus did not despair at the magnitude of this task. He was reliable and thorough. He would get the job done eventually. He hardly knew anything about the Soul Drinkers. He had studied their history in great detail, of course, and it indicated a zealously loyal chapter, independent of will, but ready to throw its valuable space marines against the odds in the Emperor's name. But that was not the chapter he faced now. The Soul Drinkers had broken so violently with their faith in the Imperium that their heresy left nothing of the chapter's previous personality. Thaddeus knew that Sarpedian, who had taken command of the rebellious Soul Drinkers, would be the primary force behind the chapter's new blasphemous existence. Sarpedian was a psyker, one of the chapter's librarians, and highly decorated throughout his 70-year service. He would be tough to crack, probably impossible. Thaddeus knew he would have to kill him. Sarpedian would have to die before the chapter could be broken. Thaddeus might be able to do it himself and might have to call in other inquisitors with their own resources, perhaps agents of the Officio Assassinorum, or even the planet-scouring Exterminatus once he had located the Soul Drinkers and driven them into a corner. Messy and costly. But every drop of spilt Imperial blood would be worth it. A rebel space marine chapter was a danger too great, and unpredictable to forgive. All these thoughts, as they often did, occupied Thaddeus as he sat in the darkened navigation chamber of the Crescent Moon. The circular chamber formed an auditorium of upholstered reclining couches that could have held a couple hundred, but Thaddeus was usually the only one there, silent and thought as he sunk into the deep padding. The seating was reclined because the navigational display was projected onto the vast glowing disk of the ceiling, shining down on the chamber like a full moon. The Crescent Moon was Thaddeus's own ship, a ribbed gunmetal gray cylinder with vast particle scoops like the fronds of an anemone spouting from below. These fueled the four enormous reactors just behind them, leaving the rest of the ship to house the bridge, living quarters, cargo holds, machine spirit chamber, and the rest of the many places that a spaceship needed to function. Thaddeus's own quarters and that of his interrogator, Shin, were armored sections in the heart of the ship. The inside of the ship was furnished to Thaddeus's taste, simply and darkly. The ship was a rare creature, the sort of craft shipyards of the Imperial Navy couldn't make anymore, assembled centuries before from parts millennia old by one of Thaddeus's mentors. It was fast and comfortable, and only needed a crew of a few dozen, which gave Thaddeus some valued privacy. However, with the stormtroopers and sisters occupying the refitted cargo sections, the ship was feeling rather more crowded of late. "Sector map," Thaddeus said, and the Vox sensors switched the star map from the shining star field to a map of the sector, with many star systems and planets flagged with names and coordinates. The Crescent Moon was still orbiting around Chorus, and Thaddeus had to give some thought to where he would head next, probably towards the nearest inquisitorial fortress or subsector headquarters to relate the paltry scraps of information he had found to the Ordo Hereticus. The cluster of agar worlds was surrounded by a ring of populous hive worlds and manufactoria planets, many of which have their own permanent inquisitorial presence. Thaddeus was trying to decide which one would be the least grim place to explain his lack of progress when the Voxcasters chimed in alarm. An incoming transmission. The astropathic choir, the half-dozen telepaths who received and transmitted messages between Thaddeus and the rest of the Imperium, spoke in unison over the box, their voices whispering and raspy. "From some subsector command Therian, Sector Boris Minor, Ultima Segmentum, Ordo Hereticus Naval Liaison Staff Report, Rogue Space Hulk, possible Adeptus Astartes activity, report to follow. Have faith lest your unbelief consume you." Thaddeus pulled himself upright and walked to the darkened auditorium towards the door that led toward the bridge. To tell the truth, he had little hope that the requests he had made of the Hereticus command, but he had been informed via Astropath of many unusual discoveries that matched certain criteria, including the possible presence of space marines, would bring in information of value. Now a space hulk had been found by the Imperial Navy, and the find had become known to the section of the Ordo Hereticus that kept out watch for the fleets of the Ultima Segmentum. For whatever reason, they had suspected the superhuman warriors of the Adeptus Astartes were involved. It was 1,000 to 1 shot the soul drinkers were the space marines in question. Literally, for they said there were space marine literally, for there were 1,000 space marine chapters, though Thaddeus suspected that true number could be anything. The bulkhead slid open, and instead of the corridor beyond, Thaddeus was confronted by the sight of the pilgrim. Hey, Grandma. I'm not right now, but if you want to, you can drop the bolt by the nut off. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I'm kind of in the middle of something. So if you just want to drop it off by, that'd be all right. Okay. Cool. Tall and surrounded by a crowd of thick, sickly incense, the pilgrim's face was hidden by the tattered dark gray hood of his robes. His hands were wrapped in heavy bandages. Thick cables ran from within the hood, down the quietly humming respirator clipped to the leather belt at the waist, to assist whatever was under those robes to breathe. The bulky power pack on his back, which the pilgrim's portable life support systems gave him a crippled and hunchbacked look. The ever-present incense was billowing from the twin sensors that topped the pack, and a faint glow burned through the rents and frays in the shroud the pilgrim was fueled by the surface. Thaddeus permitted the creature to be referred to as the pilgrim because he professed to be an utterly devoted follower of the emperor, and he served Thaddeus as an expression of his fervor. Though Thaddeus valued him greatly, the pilgrim had a habit of acting in the most sinister manner, occasionally seeming to anticipate Thaddeus's movements. "Inquisitor," it said in a heavy, monotone, half-mechanical voice, "the Hulk, will we go?" The pilgrim turned and followed Thaddeus as he headed past it toward the bridge. The pilgrim must have been monitoring the information on Thaddeus. Thaddeus knew the upper echelons of the Hereticus must be spying on him most of the time, but he was not happy the pilgrim is spying on him too. Still, Thaddeus knew better than to risk a rift with the creature. "Perhaps," said Thaddeus, "we are duty-bound to follow up any clues, but the chances of the find being relevant are, it is them. Unless you have some intelligence I have not received, pilgrim, it would not do to get our hopes up. We have received more promising leads than this before." "Think on it, Inquisitor." In the pilgrim's voice, the rank sounded like an insult. "One craft is more difficult to track than a fleet. A hulk is large enough to house a whole chapter. And what loyal chapter would sink to taking up residence on a space hulk? The perversion of such an idea would suit Sarpedian perfectly." The pilgrim knew the histories of the soul drinkers in depth, and had read of the many great victories they had won in the emperor's name, from the dawn of the second founding to the eve of their heresy. It had instilled in him a hatred of what the chapter had become. It was a hatred that rivaled Sisters Assyrian's religious faith. The pilgrim was a profiler and an expert in the means and beliefs of the soul drinkers, and all he could be was the most valuable individual in Thaddeus's entourage if it all came down to guessing which way Sarpedian would run. "We can't be sure," said Thaddeus. The Ordo Xenos was tracking more than 700 hulks and suspected hulks in the last count, and they were the only ones they were willing to mention. "You are right, of course, Inquisitors," replied the pilgrim. "One ship amongst hundreds gives us long odds. Perhaps you are pursuing a better lead at the moment, one strong enough to negate the value of optimism in our mission." Thaddeus had long ago decided not to rise to the pilgrim's baiting. If he wasn't so useful, Thaddeus would have refused to accept him into the strike force when it was first assembled by the Ordo Hereticus. But the feel the pilgrim had for the soul of the renegade chapter was one of the few edges Thaddeus had. They came to a bulkhead in the form of the massive set of double doors. Thaddeus spoke a code word, and the doors swung open. Thaddeus and the pilgrim stepped through the carnivorous space. The bridge of the crescent moon was suspended above the engineering decks, and the navigational consoles and the command pulpit looked down on the massive spinning plasma turbines that churned away 100 meters below. The engine gang, pale-skinned and red-eyed men who rarely emerged from the depths of the ship's engines, could be seen scuttling between the turbines, making adjustments in anticipation of the crescent leaving orbit and putting into the warp. Thaddeus had no flag captain. He commanded his own ship. Servitors were slaved in most of the consoles so they could relay his commands directly. The platforms of the bridge held only the servitors, Thaddeus and the Pilgrim, Sister Assyrian, and Colonel Vin of the Hereticus stormtroopers. Sister, Colonel, Thaddeus said briskly, our course is for Subsector Therian. Have your troops make ready for warp travel. At his words, the servitors twitched as they fed his commands to the Crescent's machine spirit. A space hulk is an environment not to be taken lightly. You may be required to put your troops at considerable risk. The men of the Hereticus Storm Regiment will be ready, said Vin. Vin had been mind-wiped several times, owing to things he and his men had seen as they fought the Hereticus War against witchery and corruption. He had been forced to learn the ways of fighting several times in the course of his life, and the result was a wealth of experience and battle instinct that he could not remember receiving, but which made him an effective leader and an unquestioning imperial servant. His bland features hid utter ruthless, and beneath the black and red stormtrooper fatigues, he was uncovered in scars for the many near-suicide missions he had led. The regiment, actually a vast body of men dispersed across uncountable inquisitorial retinues and fortresses, had been seconded to the Ordo Hereticus for so long they now had nothing to do with their parent imperial guard at all. Instead, being raised at Hereticus' request and trained in inquisitorial facilities, Thaddeus had 5 platoons, over 200 men in the Crescent Moon's cargo holds, every one of them rigorously conditioned to face any horror that their assault pattern lasguns and perform the most gruesome tasks at Thaddeus' request. Thaddeus ascended the short flight of steps to the command pulpit that overshadowed the banks of servitor armed consoles and monitors. He tapped the subsector code on the glowing lectern, and a line of coordinates flashed up, streaming to the half minds of the Crescent servitors. The ship's lone navigator, a recluse named Praxis, who had not left his cramped quarters in the ship's prow for months on end, would even now be preparing to gaze into the warp and guide the ship to its treacherous currents. Has he had some insight? Sister Assyrian inquired. She was standing by the pulpit and watching the Pilgrim, who looked down on the rumbling engines and the engine gang that got them started. He seemed confident the Hulk has something to do with the soul drinkers. I have reason to trust his judgment. I understand that I am under your command, Inquisitor, that he and I will be called upon to fight the same battle. But it makes me uneasy that I have so little idea of who or what he is. Thaddeus smiled. Sister, do you think me a radical? You should not believe in the rumors you hear. We are not all demon-baiting madmen in the Inquisition. The Pilgrim is not a monster. Sister Assyrian did not return his smile. She had gained a reputation as a dependable commander of battle sisters working alongside the Inquisition. She would have had more than just rumors. Many of them were true. Thaddeus had himself been involved in clearing the mess left by Eisenhorn heresies and the destruction of the rogue Hereticus cell on Clactus Cherexium. The sisters wonder, Inquisitor, that is all. They must be certain they are commanded by those that have the same depth of faith as they do. Idle chatter undermines the purity of faith, and it would be better for me if you were a little more open about your companions. The Pilgrim can be trusted, sister. You have my word on this, and that is all you need. Now you should make sure your sisters are prepared for departure. We will be in the Empyrean for some weeks. Sister Assyrian nodded curtly and strode off the bridge, boots of her black lacquered armor clacking on the metal floor of the bridge. Colonel Vin followed her, stepping smartly as if on the parade ground. The preparations took little time. Thaddeus valued the Crescent Moon partly because the procedures for beginning a major warp journey, which on an Imperial battleship would take days of tech administrations, could be handled in hours. Soon the massive engines roared and lit the bridge from beneath with the bright orange of plasma glow. The flaring particle scoops folded in the cylindrical body of the ship, and blue-white bolts of energy arced off the hull. The crescent moon drifted out of high orbit, and the engines fired. Inhabitants of the agro world looked up to see a tiny, bright star winking suddenly in the sky and then disappear. One of them, Adept Clover, sighed a prayer of gratitude to the emperor that the visitors had not taken him with them. He turned back to the never-ending mountain of paperwork. Chapter 2. The sky had turned dark over Humanix. The old hive world was locked in perpetual twilight, lit only by the weak orange glow of heat sink exhaust and the flickering, dying lumospheres that were winking out one by one as the planet died. Over High Quintus, home to a rapidly decreasing population of almost 1 billion, it rained greasy ash as the pyres of the dead began to tower over the looted palaces of the nobles. The hive city's screams could be heard for kilometers around, wailing sirens of Arbite's riot control tanks, the shriek of collapsing tunnelways as hordes of citizens tried to flee the latest hotspot, roars of explosions and looters tripped booby traps, or overladen tramp shuttles crashed on runaway pads. And the smell, burning, certainly. It could hardly be otherwise when fire was the only thing that could keep anything clean anymore. And spilt full fuel. And panicked sweat. But there was something else, sweet but caustic. A smell that made nostrils winkle and eyes water. It seeped the entire city, from pleasure galleries to the underhive, to the endless maintenance warren and the gold-plated halls of trade. It seeped out into the barren wastes between cities. Even in the wilds outside the city, those who tried to flee by land could smell it. And just before seething pollutants, Flats claimed this was the stench of the plague. Some had called it the White Death, or the Underhive Pox, or Spirit Rot. The doctors who tended to the city's ailing aristocracy invented long, complex, high Gothic names for it. But by the time the old governor, Houston, had succumbed, his body was a mass of seething welts, along with his family and most of the staff. It was known simply as the plague. No one knew how to cure it. Everything from full blood transplants from the super rich to the folk remedies devised when the city was young were tried and failed. In desperation, the people looked for a cause, and scores of innocents were burned as pox-spreading political agents or witches. By the time the pyres of the plague dead broke the city skyline, even being infected was a death sentence. But no one could tell where the infection came from, and trying to understand it just made it kill quicker. Some got out. The administrative offices cut through the brown red tape to get to the higher echelons to safety. Some of the manufactorium owners made the most of their razor-sharp business sense to buy themselves passage out of Quintus as passengers on fleeing pleasure yachts or human ballast on smugglers' scows. Others could run but did not. The governor had done the most noble thing of his reign and presided over the death of his city. The Adeptus Arbites decided without debate to stand their ground, preserve the emperor's laws, even as the city fell apart. The preachers of the Adeptus Ministrum stayed and bellowed the emperor's praises from the temples crammed with desperate, infected citizens. But the hundreds of millions who filled High Quintus's thousands of layers all wished they had the chance to flee one of the pitifully few craft that was escaping. Any craft large enough to carry a significant number of people was shot down by orbital defense lasers, maintaining the quarantine over Humanix. Those who escaped did so in a trickle, barely a dent in the massive doomed population. That, of course, did not stop larger ships from taking off and being turned into long burning streaks in the sky. More omens of death for the people below. But there were some smaller ships in the city that might run the quarantine blockade. Some spaceports were still operational, and Whatever word went around there was a ship about to launch, hordes of half-dead victims piled up around the launch pads and ship hangars. Most of the time, there were no ships, but as the plague reached its height on Ventral Dock 31, Cartel Polos managed to salvage a small research vessel just space-worthy enough to get the House Patriarch and his immediate family off Hive Quintus. Sure enough, masses of plague victims swarmed against the walls around Ventral Dock 31, held at bay by the private army of Cartel Polos. Shotgun blasts ripped into the crowd as the ships fueled and prepared for takeoff. It was almost the last hope for anyone trying to escape the plague. Hope was the last commodity of all. But when a massive explosion tore out a section of the east wall, all hope disappeared. Otto's senses in Sergeant Salk's helmet snapped his pupils shut as the glare of the explosion burst across the east wall. From his squad vantage point in the ruins of Havelock, like an island in the center of the heaving plague-infected crowd, he could see chunks of Ferrocrete hurled into the air with massive thunderclap. Polo's guards were thrown off the battlements, and a ripple ran through the crowd as the front ranks were blown backward by the force of the explosion. Karek's demolition charge had done the job. Separated from the squad, Karek would be lucky to survive the meetup with the rest of the squad, if any of them got inside the spaceport at all. But it didn't matter now. Captain Dreo was dead and Salk was in charge. The squad had secured their target, and he understood that if he had to cash in the lives of his battle brothers to complete the mission, he would do so. Go! He yelled into the Vox, and the 6 remaining soul drinkers vaulted from the burned-out windows of the shattered Hadlock. They landed in the thick cloud, and Salk felt festering limbs pushing against him as he sunk into the crowd as if in the ocean. He clambered to his feet and saw the rest of the squad battling against the human tide. Space Marines were a clear head and shoulders taller than the tallest unaugmented man, and Salk easily spotted the Marines of his squad. Kryn with the plasma gun, Drian, Portis, Aen, and Big Nicias, hauling the squad's sole prisoner. Nicias had been forced to abandon his missile launcher after the mission's bloody early stages, where Drell was lost, and had fought on with knife and bolt pistol. He had accepted responsibility for hauling the prisoner, head covered and wrist bound, with his free hand. Salk forged a way through the heaving crowd. Lolling mouth, maddened faces loomed the masses, and hands grabbed at him. They were lit by fires and burned in the high spaces rising all around the mountain ranges. And the searchlights directing the fire of the soldiers on the breached walls of the spaceport. There must have been 10,000 crowding up against the east wall alone, and Salk could see where they would pile up, living and dead against the barricades beneath the walls. Salk pushed through them, his power armor barging bodies aside. He picked up and threw those in front of him. He didn't want to hurt these people. They could not help the madness of the Imperium into which they had been born. But if they themselves were in his way, he would crush them underfoot. The mission had turned from ugly on the outset, and it would end ugly too. The crowd surged forward as the front rakes covered in the blast and began to pour into the breach. Gunfire shattered from ahead as the Cartel Polos troops poured their fire into the plague victims that clambered over the rumble of the platform to the spaceport. A missile streaked down from the closest watchtower and blew a hole in the surging crowd. Salk pushed against the crowd and burst out into the smoldering crater, ringed with blackened bodies, a short sprint from the yawning breach in the wall. The wall was 20 meters high and several thick, but the charge had torn a huge section out of it. Autogun fire was already spraying from behind the fallen chunks of masonry, and shotgun sparks barking beyond the rubble as Cartel Polo's troops hunted down the plague victims that got through. Nicias, Kryn, with me, spoke Salk as he fired a couple of shots at the gaudily pressed Polo's troop ducking behind the masonry. The rest, covering fire. The huge form of Nicias tore out of the crowd beside Salk, followed by Kryn. Already some of the troopers spotted the massive purple armored space marines and were directing their fire towards them, rising as the biggest threats in the east wall. Autogun fire spanked off Salk's shoulder armor, and he returned fire, almost blind, as he put his head down and ran across the open ground towards the cover of the rubble in the breach. The two space marines, back in the fringes of the crowd, opened up on full auto with their bolt guns, splattering the wall with miniatures explosions. Troopers on the walls jerked and fell, some tumbling into the lip of the wall and the barbed wire and barricades below, their bodies mingling with those of fallen plague victims. Salk slid into cover as a heavy bolter on the watchtower stitched fire all around them. Nicias was seconds behind him, firing up at the watchtower. There was a missile launcher and a heavy stubber up there, and by now the Polos troops would have marked Salk and his space marines as priority targets. And with good reason. The spear of white heat ripped from the open ground behind Salk, and the top of the watchtower billowed open. The blast of plasma impact compressed the fire point, incinerating whatever men and munitions inside. Kryn, plasma gun shimmering with haze and heat, rose from his charging circuits. Nicias's prisoner had given up struggling by now. Dressed in simple rust-covered overalls, blackened with grime and the residue of bolter fire, the prisoner simply hung on as Nicias hauled the ragdoll figure around with one hand, while the other held the bolt pistol. Salk ducked to one side to see what lay within the breach. A sergeant of the Polos troops was organizing his men into the firing line across the breach. Most of them were armed with autoguns, but there were a few shotguns mixed in. There were about 20 men, all dressed in the emerald green of cartel polos, the bright gold buttons and buckles, and shiny black knee-high boots. Most of the time, they were used by the cartel for show, hence the garish uniforms. The cartel had built itself an intimidation value of private army, and these were well-trained and motivated men. Salk nodded, and Nicias and Kryn, and then cast a handful of coin-sized frag grenades past the slab of rubble that he lay beside. A series of low, whumping explosions sounded, and Salk scrambled up the slope of the rubble towards the firing line through the falling dust kicked by the grenades. The first shots were sprayed on full auto to keep the troopers' heads down. He had switched to semi-auto and fired as he ran, bolts kicking up crimson spray as they snapped back heads of those soldiers firing back. Shells impacted all around, a couple registering as flashes of pain as they penetrated the ceramite of his armor. Salk ran through the bursts of pain and left in the heart of the firing line. This is how the Soul Drinkers fought, cold and fast. A space marine was the safest in the very heat of battle, face to face with the enemy, where his armor, weapons, and physical strength and valor were magnified, and the resolve of his enemy could be shattered. As Kryn's recharged plasma gun burst liquid plasma over the far end of the line, Salk clubbed the stock of his bolter in the first of the faces as he saw. Streaked with grime and lined with fatigue, the troopers stared in disbelief at the 3-meter killing machine that reared over, and even as Salk's gun cracked into the side of his head, Salk pulled the body beneath him, drawing his combat knife and slashing the trooper beneath the first. Salk's second victim, clutching a deep wound across his torso, scored by the monomolecular edge of his knife. Nicias's bolt pistol spat shells into the troopers along the line, and many were running, only to be cut down by Nicias. Nicias was still hefting the prisoner as if the quivering body weighed nothing. If the prisoner died, then the whole mission would fail, but Nicias was using his massive, barrel-chested body to protect the prisoner from incoming fire. He was a huge man, even for a space marine, which is why he was one of the chapter's few heavy weapons troopers, and the few shots that hit him burst against his armor a shower of sparks. Salk pulled a third body off his knife and pumped half a magazine of bolter shells through the breach, showering the threshold of the spaceport with fire. The troop's officer was trying to rally them into a new firing line on the smooth surface of the spaceport itself. Kryn vaporized them in a gout of superheated plasma, and the Polos troopers broke and ran. Squad Salk, report in, Vox Salk hurriedly to the Space Marines who had been behind to cover assault. Ayan, Horus, Dryan. The only reply was a broken fragment of speech cut by the static, which other of them was still alive was swamped by the masses of the crowd so heavily his Vox equipment had been damaged. Since the receiver was implanted in the ear and the transmitter in the throat, that meant a fractured skull at least. There was no way for good 3 Space Marines to die, pulled down by a baying, half-mad mass of dying civilians. No way to lose soul drinkers, when their very entirety were down to about 700 battle brothers. The mission was costlier than the one the chapter could really afford. If it succeeded, Commander Sarpedian had assured Drail and Squad Salk would be doing the Emperor's work in an immediate and valuable way. Salk didn't know what Sarpedian's plan was. Drail had, but he was dead, far beneath High Quintus. But Salk had believed in Sarpedian, the mutated visionary librarian who had rallied the soul drinkers against the evils of chaos and the blindness of the Imperium alike. If he had to die here to ensure the prisoner was delivered as Sarpedian commanded, then Salk would die. Salk waved the 2 Space Marines with him forward, and he slammed a fresh magazine to his bolter. They had to move now, while the troopers in front of them were scattered, and the crowd had yet to surge behind them. Even now, he could hear the masses pouring through the newly cleared breach. 3 men, even Space Marines, could not down the human tide. Salk clambered over the crest of the rubble and saw the Ventral Dock 31 spread out before him. Lit by makeshift landing lights and burning fuel drums, it was a wide expanse of blast-stained ferrocrete, with landing zones marked all over it. Massive maintenance sheds and building-sized docking clamps broke the surface, and many of these had been transformed into fire points by the cartel Poyos. Emerald uniformed troopers manned heavy stubbers and artillery pieces. There were several hundred meters away when Salk's immediate objective. An ugly, crouched craft, like a huge metal fly, squatted on one of the lounge zones. Bulky servitors lugged thick fuel lines toward the craft as the maintenance crews tried frantically to prep it for takeoff. A gaggle of exotically dressed men, probably the leader of the cartel Polos, were being escorted across the spaceport by shotgun-wielding troops with crimson as well as emerald in their uniforms. Household troops, bodyguards of the cartel heads. No match individually for Space Marines, but they could be guaranteed not to give up. The ship was the only way off Humanix, and the soul drinkers had to ensure that they were the ones that took it. They had been dropped onto the planet what felt like a lifetime ago by drop pod because the risks from the orbital batteries were too great for a Thunderhawk gunship to bring them down. The plan had been for Dreo to lead them out in the barrens outside the city so they could be picked up later, maybe months afterward, but the risk from the plague extended even there, and the prisoner could not have survived. Ventral Dock 31 was the only choice left. Salk ducked back down beyond the heavy stubber fire from the closest hardpoint. A pair of 2-man teams was hiding amongst the huge metal claws of a docking clamp, covering the breach. Salk charged again, sending a volley of shots tearing into the heavy stubber position. Heavy chains of fire ripped into the ground all around him, one catching him in the greave and almost pinching him to the ground. He spotted Nicias out of the corner of his eye, taking shots at the torso as he tried to shield the prisoner. A plasma blast washed over the docking clamp, and a couple of gunners were churned into bursts of ash. But the fire kept coming, pinning Salk and Nicias to the edge of the spaceport concourse. A sudden explosion ripped the docking clamp apart, sending chunks of metal flying. Split sandbags fountaining the earth, broken bodies flying, heavy stubber rounds cooked off like chains of firecrackers. From the wreckage of a single black-clad figure ran, gun in hand. Salk was about to open fire when he realized the figure was as tall as he was, and power armor, charred, black, but with the Chalice symbol still poked out on bone of the shoulder. "Good work, Brother Carrick," said Sergeant Salk. Carrick crouched in the firing position, keeping troopers away from the fire point. Salk sprinted to the sky, Nicias behind him, and another plasma blast burst among the fire point. Along the walls, Kryn broke cover. Fire rattled over the Space Marines' heads, and Salk returned fire from the spaceport was being drawn to the crowds now, swarming over the rubble behind him. Now, he voxed, and the surviving Space Marines outrun the approaching edge of the horde, charging towards the lone spacecraft. Salk sprayed bolter fire at any glimpse of Emerald, and Kryn ripped a plasma shot into the ground by the Poyos' heads. Salk kept small arms fire impacting. Salk felt small arms fire impacting against the ground all around him as he ran, wringing off his armor. He switched to semi-auto and flicked shots off at the bodyguards, trying to drag the dignitaries toward the ship. Two fell, and other two spasmed as bolt shots from Nicias tore through him. Carrick sprayed shells around the rear of the ship, and the bodyguards fell, trying to pull themselves between the incoming fire and the dignitaries. Saul could see the heads of the cartel Poyos now, clad in impractical aristocratic dress. With so many layers, they looked corpulent and farcical as they scrambled to the rear of the ship, trying to take shelter behind the sternward landing gear. The bodyguards were opening fire at the Space Marine and the crowd spilling over the concourse, but they didn't have the range of the Space Marine's disciplined bolter fire. A quick volley of snapshots from Saul took one man's head off and knocked another off his feet like a punch to the gut. Carrick held the rest pinned down, and Kryn vaporized a handful of troopers trying to bring a missile launcher to the rear. Salk reached to the brow of the ship, firing all the time, switching magazines of Nicias, covering him with pistol fire, then sniping at the bodyguards through the landing gear. "Get aboard!" Vox called Salk to Nicias. Covered by Carrick, Nicias ran around the shuttle and threw the prisoner over the extended boarding ramp onto the passenger compartment. A spray of fire sparked off his armor, tearing chunks from the ceramite as he vaulted from his huge form of the ship. Kryn was next, then Salk and Carrick, firing full auto as they clambered inside. Inside, the small compartment was luxuriously upholstered in the deep, clashing greens and reds of the cartel polos. There was room for about a dozen back there, and seemed cramped and filled with the bulk of 4 Space Marines in their power armor. Salk glanced at the remnants of the squad. Carrick's armor was charred, and the purple paintwork had almost all blistered off. His helmet had gone, and one side of his face was badly burned. Kryn's gauntlets were smoking from the overheated plasma gun, and Nicias' armor was riddled with bullet scars. Many of Nicias' wounds were bleeding, as his blood clotted over instantly the dark red crystals. The prisoner was slumped on the carpeted floor, motionless except for shallow breathing. Salk turned and saw the hatchway leading the cockpit of the shuttle. It was shut. He slung his bolter, dug his fingers in the edge of the door, and ripped it clear of its frame. Shrieking metal. In the cockpit were 2 pilots in emerald uniforms, young and terrified, shivering with fear. They had neural jacks plugged in the sockets of the backs of their shaven heads. Salk glanced at the readouts around the instrument panels in front of them. The shuttle was fueled up and ready to go. Salk removed his helmet, feeling sweat running down his face. The smell of gun smoke from his bolter, burned skin from Carrick, and the ever-present miasma of the city pollution flooded his systems. "Launch," he said. The 2 pilots paused for a second, mesmerized by the immense armored figure that had just torn his way into the cockpit. Then they turned to the shuttle controls, almost mechanically. They began to switch on the engines and direct the thrusters. The rumble of the main engines cut through the background noise of gunfire and screams. Salk turned back to the passenger compartment. Past the closing boarding ramp, he could see the crowd swirling away just meters from the ship. Emaciated plague victims, dragging down cartel police bodyguards and the heads of the cartel themselves. Kryn lined up a shot into the crowd, but Salk pushed his plasma gun aside. There was no need. With a few seconds, the shuttle would be aloft. There was nothing these people could do to them now. The boarding ramp swung shut, and there was a hiss as the interior pressurized. Salk looked through the window and saw through the front view screen the spires of Hive Quintus burning and smoke-laden clouds boiling up ahead. The primary thrusters kicked in, and the craft lurched violently. away from the burning nightmare of Humanex and Squad Quintus. Salk, leaving many good soul drinkers in the city, including Captain Dreo, who none of the chapter could easily afford to lose. But as their prisoner survived, it was brought off planet. Any losses were ultimately acceptable. Commander Sarpedian had made that very clear to Captain Dreo, and Salk had been compelled to carry out those same orders when Dreo was lost. Salk turned to his squad. Karik and Nicias both needed medical treatment, and Salk had been apprenticed to the chapter apothecarian as a novice before he had been selected as a squad sergeant and then taken to Sarpedian's confidence after the terrible chapter war. Most importantly, the prisoner was in shock and would have to be properly looked at after. They would have to search the shuttle for supplies. It would be some time before they could expect pickup, and they would have to keep the prisoner alive. But for the time being, he would have the squad enter half sleep and take turns watching the prisoner and settle to the routine that would keep them alive until they could return to the chapter. Salk didn't know the details of Sarpedian's plan, but he knew enough to know this mission was only the start.